Hey everyone, this is a video on section 4.9, barriers to economic growth and or economic development. In this one, we're just going to look at economic barriers to growth and development. First, we need to look at what a poverty cycle is. We're going to sort of refer back to this diagram later. So I'll just go through how it works. Poor countries, undeveloped countries, they have low incomes. I think we all understand that. What this leads to is low savings. They have to spend everything they earn. They can't afford to put money away in savings. This lack of savings means that there isn't a bank of savings there to invest. So firms have trouble investing in physical capital, and individuals, families, they don't have the money to invest in their own human capital either. And natural capital also gets neglected. So what happens is we get this low productivity of labor and land. So we don't get much economic activity coming. This leads to low growth in incomes. And if we're not growing from our low incomes, it just takes us right back to the start, to the low incomes. It's a perpetuating cycle. We need to find ways to break that cycle. Escape the trap. So the first economic barrier we're going to look at is rising income inequality. As you know, we've seen the Lorenz curve before. Now, how does inequality limit growth and development? Well, the low income earners, and there's going to be a lot of them when there's such unequal income, they can't invest in themselves, invest in their own capital to make themselves better off, and therefore that doesn't happen across the economy. We get low growth. The wealthy few, they make a lot of the incomes, but they have a low marginal propensity to consume. So they might save a lot, or they might spend more likely on imports, which are likely to be the luxury goods that the wealthy can afford, and those in these undeveloped countries, they tend to be in the form of imports, those luxury goods. We've also found that the wealthy few can have significant political power, and that tends not to be good for development outcomes. Limited access to infrastructure is another barrier. So firstly, how does that help? How would infrastructure help? They get increase in trade, more access to ports, things like rail, getting goods out to sea through the ports can lower production costs and make it more internationally competitive. When you get increased foreign direct investment, the multinationals, the companies that are going to do the foreign direct investment, they want lower costs, and they want to be able to take the goods that they are producing there and get them out of the country for export. So the infrastructure is going to help them do that. Health and education, if we invest in schools and hospitals, then they then exist and people can increase their human capital in that way. Why is it actually limited? Money. Money is a big issue here. They've got a low tax revenue base because they've got low incomes in the country. And they've also got less ability to charge for the use of the infrastructure. So things like water, electricity, they often have to provide that below cost, which means that they don't get the return on that to further invest in more infrastructure. And due to the lack of tax money, there's also inadequate maintenance, so this infrastructure can degrade over time. And limited access by the poor, generally, because of that large political influence we talked about before with inequality, that can lead to the infrastructure not going to where it's most needed. So it might service just the richer communities who have that political influence. Limited access to appropriate technology. So appropriate technology, that's which well suited to particular economic, geographical, ecological, and climate conditions. So how it can help is that appropriate technology can help break this poverty cycle. So with the physical capital here, the technology can increase the productivity of labour and land, can lead to higher growth in income, higher incomes, and then that cycle can continue on perhaps. Now, why don't we have appropriate technology? Money. You're going to see this one a bit, that little picture. They're unable to afford the technology, perhaps. They often have to buy that from overseas. They don't have those developed industries in their own countries. And again, they may not be able to develop those technologies in their countries. They don't have the established industries. And some of the technology can be labour replacing rather than labour using, because if it's coming from a developed country, whereas these countries, they still need people in work. So labour using technologies can be much more appropriate. It can be harder to find the most appropriate technologies. And they also have different climate conditions. We'll revisit this later, but most of them, developing countries, are in tropical and subtropical environments, which are different to most of the developed countries in the world. We've got low levels of human capital, so education. We've talked about human capital a little bit. That's a definition there. How can education help growth and development? It can lead to more productivity, higher quality of resources. That can lead to international competitiveness, so we can sell more exports, right? Bring in money that way. We can substitute imports. If we have a more educated workforce, we can develop our own goods that can compete with the imports. So we don't have so much money leaving the country, we can compete ourselves. And the development of technology, education can clearly lead to that. Jobs, therefore income. And what we see when we have jobs and we have the competitiveness, etc., we have tax revenues. Those tax revenues can be used to fund all the things that these developing countries are lacking, the education, the health, the infrastructure. Another way that education can help is by having more gender equality. Education is a great leveler in that way. Of course, that assumes that girls can be educated in that country. Not always a safe assumption. How can education help? Again, the foreign direct investment by multinational firms that can act as I like this picture that I made, by the way, of a magnet drawing in money. So multinationals, they can take advantage of an educated workforce because they're going to be better at their job. So that's going to be a bit of a draw card for the multinationals to invest in the country. That can bring in tax revenue. It can also bring in some technology. We get technology transfer when we get the FDI, and we get the expertise. So these multinationals, they come in and we learn, the developing countries learn their methods and techniques and can boost the human capital in the home country. Education can also lead to improved health outcomes, reduced spread of disease, people having greater understanding of their bodies, and we can get more qualified medical professionals in the country. Okay, why are there low levels of education? Oh, big surprise, no money. So that tax revenue base not there. Sometimes it's just the allocation of the proportion of the budget allocated to education. We've seen in the data that the income of a country it's correlated to the levels of education, but it's not a perfect correlation. Some poorer countries can do much better in education, and that's partly because of how they allocate their budgetary resources. And of course, low household incomes make it hard for people to invest in themselves, their own education. There can also be gender discrimination. This is a picture of an Afghan primary school. Now, in Afghanistan, these girls are now not allowed to go to high school. So that's an extreme example, but there are often biases that stop girls from getting the full education that they should be getting. And some of these countries, there can be a large distance from home to school, which can make it very difficult. Not everyone has cars. Sometimes children are walking for hours a day. It can be very difficult. Okay, and health. How can health help growth and development? Higher productivity. We get lower birth rates if people understand contraception and have access to contraception, which is largely considered healthcare. And if we have those lower birth rates, we can invest more in the human capital. Families, if they've got fewer children, can invest more in the children that they do have to greater help them achieve a better life. So they can invest in their health and education. Why are there low levels of health in these countries? Lack of money, big surprise. So insufficient funding. For example, 37% of Africans do not receive medical treatment due to the high cost. So it's just not accessible to a lot of people. Distance from medical care, like it was with schools, can be an issue. And this is a broader issue, but a lack of access to clean water and sanitation. So the lack of infrastructure can cause there to be a lack of health in the country. Okay, we can have in these developing countries a dependence on primary sector production, so primary commodities. So we've got a little table here. This shows commodities as a share of total exports. So here, Bolivia, 95% of their exports are commodities. This is a small list of countries, but if I had a longer list, a lot of the numbers would be quite similar. And within that, even just a reliance on one commodity. So oil for Chad, 92% of their exports, or 92% of their commodities. So a high percentage. Oh, that's the light gone off. Venezuela, 81%, just on oil. So again, similar story across multiple countries. Now, commodities, they tend to have a low PED value and a low PES value. We're going to see why this is a bit of a problem. So they have a low PED value because they are necessities, and they don't have close substitutes. So these things that they sell, everyone needs them, and there's no close substitutes, so they have inelastic demand, and they have inelastic supply as well, because there is a long production time for these things, and often to produce more you need to spend a lot of money. So that can stop supply being so responsive to an increase in price, if there is one. Okay, why is this a problem? We get volatile prices. So we can see here, if we've got inelastic demand and supply shifts, price changes quite a lot. If we've got inelastic supply and demand shifts, price changes quite a lot. So volatile export earnings can lead to volatile current account balances and volatile levels of government tax revenues. So if governments can't rely on revenue from year to year, they're going to stop spending to an extent. Okay, to illustrate this, this is the yearly volatility of some of these commodities. So coffee, 25%. The price of coffee could change 25% year to year, quite a lot. Okay, limited access to international markets. Tariffs are a way. So there tends to be a higher tariff on value-added goods. So, for example, there's higher tariffs on chocolate than there are on cocoa. What this means is that it can be very hard for these developing countries to expand into that secondary market rather than the primary commodities, getting into that secondary manufactured goods market because there are such high tariffs on it. In addition, developed countries tend to have higher tariffs on developing countries than on each other because highly developed countries like Australia, they tend to make free trade agreements with other developed countries. So we've got free trade agreements with the UK, New Zealand, the US, for example. And we don't have any ones with Africa. There are also a lot of subsidies that limit their access. So, for example, cotton, heavily subsidized in the US, sugar, heavily subsidized in the European Union. What that means, very hard for these countries to compete. Now, we can draw this on an international trade diagram. We can show how they can have access. So we'll do that and I'll have a look in class. Here's an example. This is pretty old, but still largely true. Developed countries were spending just over $1 billion a year on aid to developing country agriculture, but at the same time, they're spending $1 billion a day supporting their own farmers. So it makes it pretty hard for the developing country farmers to catch up, if you think about it. The informal economy can be quite the problem. Share of informal employment in total employment in 2016, 85% of employment in Africa was in the informal economy. This is a problem because, well, firstly, the informal economy exists due to lack of skills, education. But the problems that can come is that they can't charge tax on any of this employment, so there's less tax revenue to do those big things like education, health, and infrastructure. There can be exploitation, so child labour, unsafe practices. The government can't regulate these industries because they don't necessarily know about them. And therefore, the regulation can't really improve the conditions under which a majority of these people work in these poor areas. Capital flight. So this is when businesses and individuals, they take money, assets and resources from a country due to economic and political uncertainties. So the lack of confidence in the country, really. What that can do is it can discourage foreign investment. It can discourage other businesses from starting up in the country if they see other people leaving, withdrawing from the country. So if we get that less FDI, we're going to have reduced employment and income for the people in the country. We can have a depreciation of the currency if all the money is leaving. We know how that works on an exchange rate diagram. And when we have depreciation, all of our imports suddenly cost a lot more. So we can get high inflation for that reason. Balance of payments problems. If all the money is leaving, we need to have a balance of payments. So that can lead to high borrowing so that we can afford to buy the imports that we need, and therefore indebtedness, having high debt. That leads us to our next one, indebtedness. Many countries have high levels of debt, these developing countries. Some reasons for this, global financial crisis led to huge budget deficits, borrowing to support their payments. There have been large falls in commodity prices, and that's where a lot of their export revenue is coming from. Increased borrowing due to low interest rates. We had really low interest rates in the lead up to COVID and at the start of the pandemic. So all that borrowing has led into a lot of debt, and sometimes just poor governance. They're not putting that debt to the right use, or they're borrowing money, they're not managing their budgets well. How does it hinder growth and development? Debt servicing, so the opportunity cost of that spending, all the money that you go to paying off the interest and the debt is money that you can't spend developing your country. If you've got a high amount of debt, that's going to lead you to poor credit ratings, which can make it difficult to borrow more money. Oftentimes you will need to borrow more. Sometimes countries will be incentivized to increase taxes, reduce government spending in order to reduce their debt. And they're actually contractionary policies, aren't they? So that's going to hurt the economy when it might not be the best macro policy available. can also get into a debt trap, which is borrowing just to pay off the debts. And you can see if you're not using your borrowing to expand the economy, it's going to be hard to pay off those debts properly. Okay. Geographically, we have landlocked countries. A lot of developing countries are landlocked. So this is Africa. And we've got a few countries here: Chad, Burkina Faso, Uganda, Botswana. They are landlocked. There are lots more, but these are some of them. And they lack access to ports for their exports and imports. So what that means is they rely on other countries. They need to cooperate. That can lead to higher costs for them, therefore hurting their competitiveness. And there can even be conflict in those countries, rendering that impossible. Okay, and lastly, the tropical climates and endemic diseases. So I talked about this a little bit before. Developed countries tend to be in the temperate climates, so Europe, most of Australia, temperate climates. Developing countries all tend to be in the middle of the earth there, so tropical and subtropical climates. That can make it hard for them because they can experience disease due to tropical climates, so malaria, some sort of parasites, as well as the endemic diseases due to poverty. But also in the tropical climates, the weather can be a lot more extreme, which can make it hard for them to develop industries. Okay, that is what we need to talk about for economic barriers.